Lady of New York City, Charlene McRae.
Woo. Don't get up and go, y'all. Not yet, not yet. There's more. Thank you, Kathy, for your inspired leadership of BAM. Hello, Brooklyn. Happy New Year. I love you. I appreciate you. What a year we had in 2019. But I always feel good when I'm in my home borough of Brooklyn. What a year we had. I did a lot of looking back. I mean way back. And I am so grateful to Nicole Hannah-Jones and all the writers and the researchers for the work that they did with the New York Times 1619 project. Aren't we? Isn't she phenomenal? I could listen to her all day, right? We need to hear that. That project not only reveals the past and reframes our history, it helps us understand our place in the present, doesn't it? Yeah, and that's what this celebration does too. For decades, BAM has provided a space for us to reflect on what Dr. King's legacy means for us today. And there is still so much more for us to learn from the past, and not just from our collective experiences, but our individual experiences as well. I'm gonna tell you something. 2 weeks ago, I learned something that I had never realized from my own family's history. My father was a Buffalo Soldier. Yeah, I never realized that. I knew he was in the Army and that he had served abroad, but he was in the 9th Cavalry Regiment and served briefly in North Africa during World War II. And that was new information for me. This is how deeply our history is buried sometimes. I have a photo of him in his uniform, and he was 18 years old when he enlisted. 18. He was younger than our son Dante is now, just a boy. And I can't imagine how he must have felt heading overseas to fight for a country that didn't respect him and didn't believe in him. Our past and our present are filled with so many hidden truths, cruel truths, and harsh realities. The past is also brimming, though, with stories of people who overcame incredible odds, who fought for a better life for themselves, their families, and their communities. People who stood up for the rights and dignity of people who looked like them and people who did not look like them. People like Martin Luther King Jr., who called for a revolution of values and helped organize people of all ethnicities to march on Washington to demand economic justice. And then there are people like all of you. Tell me, Brooklyn, who was there with us in person or in spirit in 2012 as our family marched silently down Fifth Avenue to bring an end to stop and frisk? Who was there? Okay, I always see a few hands. Are you being shy or what? Okay, how many of you joined the biggest single protest in the nation's history, the Women's March of 2017? How many of you were there? All right, we got a few more. How many of you stood in solidarity with the brave students who walked out of their classrooms 2 years ago to stop gun violence? How many of you were there? Can I see some hands? All right, I see a few. And who was with us 2 weeks ago on the Brooklyn Bridge as we came together to denounce the rise of anti-Semitism and say in a united voice, hate has no place here? How many of you were there? Okay, I see we got to get more of you out. When we look to the past, even to the very recent past, we see how hate has a way of spreading into every crevice and corner unless we stand in its way. That's why we owe it to each other to fight for the dignity of every worker, the education of every child, the freedom of every worshiper, and the well-being of every person. So today, as we celebrate Dr. King's vision and his work, I ask you to stay focused on the positive. Stay focused on the things that bring us together. You heard Nicole Hannah-Jones, didn't you? She said, we got to stay focused. It's not over. Can you do that? Oh, come on. Do I have to come out there? Can you do that? That's better. All right, now. It is my pleasure to introduce the love of my life and partner in all things, our mayor, Bill de Blasio.
You almost had Shirlane coming out into the crowd there. To ensure that people fight for what is right and fight against all that we see around us that isn't working for us. I want to thank Shirlane for her fighting spirit. Let's thank our First Lady. Were you just spellbound by Nicole Hannah-Jones? When she said that our nation's born out of an idea, based on an idea and a lie at the same time. Doesn't that just bring together all of what we have felt? That there is something greater that we're to aspire to, that Dr. King pointed us towards, and yet we have had to live through so many lies. Dr. King was willing to say things that were not popular in his own time. Do not let the fact that there's a day named after him or a stamp with his face on or a memorial in Washington, do not let that obscure the fact that in his own time he said some very inconvenient truths. He said things that got him in trouble. He said things that the powers that be did not like. He was vilified. He was attacked. We honor him today, but we have to remember so many did not honor him in his own time. What Nicole has given us is so powerful. It's a reminder that Dr. King often revealed those truths before people wanted to hear them in so many quarters. And Dr. King did not only talk about the African American experience, he talked about this country as a whole. He did not only talk about oppression of one people, he talked about oppression of all people. He talked not just about civil rights, but he talked about economic rights, because he understood you couldn't have one without the other. But he also talked about the truth that our country tried over and over to convince its people that war was somehow a noble act. And Dr. King saw too many young black men sent off to their death in Vietnam. He saw too much of our national treasure spent killing. And he couldn't take it anymore, and a lot of people told him not to talk about the war. If you look at the history, you'll see clearly a lot of people counseled him that if he talked about the war, he would lose support, that somehow it would dilute his message. But Dr. King believed it was impossible to get to justice so long as the Vietnam War raged. In fact, how can you have justice and war at the same time? Think about it. Dr. King lived in a moment where he refused to ignore what was happening around him. Now, I want to say to all of you, we're living in another one of those moments. We have the endless wars that we've been experiencing now for decades in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now, this very moment, we could be on the verge of another even greater war with Iran. And doesn't it seem eerie to you that you turn on the television, you go online, and at any given hour it may feel like war is imminent, and then the next day it's as if nothing is happening at all? Isn't that strange? I saw something the other day that struck me. When President Trump ordered the killing of General Soleimani, it was the first time the United States of America had killed a foreign national military leader since World War II. And that was chilling to me as a reminder of what we may have entered into. Dr. King put his own life on the line when he spoke out against the Vietnam War. And in 1967, right here in New York City at Riverside Church, a speech known as Beyond Vietnam, he made explicitly clear we could not reach that fairer society if we did not stop the war. He made clear that the two could not go together. And I want you now to understand, because we all feel it, how many people in this room have a family member who served in Iraq or Afghanistan? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. And you know how many of our young people have been lost, how many young people were wounded and their lives will never be the same. I saw that with my own dad, who served in World War II, came back missing half a leg, came back with PTSD. His life was never the same. Our family was never the same. That is happening to tens of thousands of our young people now. We have lost 6,000, over 6,000 young Americans in those wars. And on top of that, we have lost a chance to fix the profound challenges of our country. I'm going to tell you something, and the human lives are what matter most, but I want to tell you something about your money as well. $6.4 trillion have been spent on those forever wars. I asked people on my staff to check the number again. I said that couldn't be possible, but $6.4 trillion spent in our name. We weren't asked our opinion, were we? But it's spent in our name, $7,000 for every taxpayer in America. If we had kept that money, if we did not pursue war but pursued peace and used that money, it could have allowed us. Small fraction of that money could have allowed us to give pre-K to every child in America for free. Every child. A small fraction of that money could have stopped the rise of emissions that now threaten the future of our Earth. A small fraction of that money. That money could have paid for, this is how much money it is. That money could have paid to fix every road and bridge and subway and school and park in the United States of America, every single one of them. Dr. King said in another great speech at the National Cathedral in Washington in 1968, he said, "War plays havoc with our domestic destinies. Something must be done, and done quickly." He knew that in 1968, and he said in the same speech, "No one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war." So I bring this to you today because somehow, all the things that have been talked about in this country, somehow, the present war, the endless wars, get swept under the rug. And the war that is looming is one day in the news and the next day it's disappeared. I say this to you in the spirit of Dr. King, and I'll conclude with this point. There are so many things Dr. King said to us that instruct us. He did not just leave us ideas pertinent to his time, he gave us a roadmap for our times. When you read his words, they immediately tell you what we need to do. And he said in that Beyond Vietnam speech, he said, "A time comes when silence is betrayal." To all of you, all the good people here today, everyone who gathers here to reflect, to learn, to think, and then to recognize how you can act. Don't participate in that betrayal, is what I say. Don't ever be silent. And the good news is, New Yorkers, we are rarely silent, isn't that right? We are not good at silence, are we? New Yorkers stood up to stop and frisk, and we beat it. We ended it. New Yorkers stood up. That Women's March, Shirlane talked about, 2017 and since, the largest demonstration in the history of the United States of America to defend the rights of women. We stood up. We are going to stand up now against the hate that has reared its head in so many communities. New Yorkers, speak up, stand up, and we must stand up against the gathering storm of this war. You know, in Vietnam, for so long, people thought the war could not be stopped, but they stood up, they spoke out. It was the people who stopped the Vietnam War. It was not the politicians, it was the people. It was the people who stopped that war. It is the people who must stop the next war. It is the people who must bring our troops home. It is the people who must save the lives of our fellow Americans and finally open the doors to a just society where all those resources are spent on fairness, on decency, on our children, on our families, on our neighborhoods. Don't ever be silent. Stand up. Thank you. God bless you all.